I haven't bought a single vegetable from a grocery store in 2 years. Not one tomato, not one head of lettuce, not one pepper. And the system that produces all my food costs me nothing to maintain. No fertilizer bills, no pest control products, no irrigation equipment, no seed purchases. And most people spend $300 or more every year just to keep their gardens struggling along. And they are still buying vegetables at the market because their gardens fail to produce enough. And the reason this happens is not because you are doing something wrong, but because your garden is designed backwards from the start. And that is the exact problem we are going to solve right now. Most gardens today are designed like war zones. You plant a crop in neat rows, and then you spend the entire season fighting to keep it alive. You are watering every single day because the soil dries out. You are weeding every week because bare ground invites competition. You are spraying for pests because monocultures attract them in concentrated waves. You are buying fertilizer every spring because the soil is depleted. And you are replacing plants every year because annuals die, and perennials struggle in conditions that work against them instead of with them. And this system is exhausting. Think about it. You spent last season watering 7 days a week, and that is an hour a day, 7 hours a week, 28 hours a month just keeping plants from dying of thirst. And you spent 2 hours every weekend pulling weeds that grew back as fast as you removed them. And you bought pest control products when aphids arrived, and fungicides when mildew spread, and fertilizers when plants turned yellow. And at the end of the season, you pulled everything out and started over. And the cost adds up fast. Most gardeners spend $300 to $500 per year on inputs: seeds, starts, amendments, pest sprays, irrigation supplies, tools that wear out, and that is just the direct cost. And the indirect cost is your time, your weekends, your evenings after work spent doing the same tasks over and over with no end in sight. And here is the reality. This system does not exist because it is the best way to grow food. It exists because it is the best way to keep you dependent. And a garden that requires constant intervention is a garden that generates constant sales. And the companies that profit from this model have spent decades convincing you that this is normal, that gardening is supposed to be hard, that you need their products to succeed. But there is another way, a way that was common knowledge for thousands of years before industrial agriculture erased it from modern practice. And that way is to design gardens that regulate themselves. Gardens where plants do the work, where soil builds instead of depletes, where water is retained instead of evaporated, where pests are managed by relationships instead of chemicals. And the reason you have not heard about this system is the same reason perennial vegetables disappeared from seed catalogs. Because a garden that regulates itself does not generate repeat sales. And that makes it worthless to the industry, even though it is incredibly valuable to you. The difference between a modern garden and a self-regulating garden is the difference between a monoculture and a polyculture. A monoculture is a single crop planted in isolation, which means it has no relationships with other plants, no built-in pest deterrents, no soil building mechanisms, and no resilience when conditions change. And monocultures are the foundation of industrial agriculture because they are easy to mechanize and easy to control. But they are terrible for soil, terrible for biodiversity, and terrible for anyone trying to grow food without constant inputs. A polyculture is the opposite. Multiple species planted together in functional relationships. And when you design these relationships correctly, the plants do jobs for each other. Some fix nitrogen, some provide shade, some suppress weeds, some deter pests, some build soil. And the result is a system that maintains itself with minimal intervention from you. Meanwhile, indigenous agriculture understood this for thousands of years. Native American Three Sisters guilds produced reliable harvests without irrigation, without fertilizer, without pest control, and without annual replanting in many cases. And the reason this worked is because the system was designed around observation, not intervention. around relationships, not extraction. And the fact that this knowledge has been almost completely erased from modern gardening tells you everything you need to know about whose interests the current system serves. Here is what most people miss about how ecosystems actually work. Plants are not passive organisms that sit in the ground waiting for you to feed them. Plants are active participants in their environment, and they trade resources with each other. They communicate through root networks and chemical signals. They create conditions that benefit their neighbors and deter their competitors. And when you understand these relationships, you stop fighting your garden and start designing it to regulate itself. The Three Sisters Guild is the clearest example of how this works. Corn, beans, and squash planted together in a specific arrangement, and each plant does a job that benefits the others. Corn is a heavy feeder. It needs a lot of nitrogen to grow tall and produce ears. And if you plant corn alone, you have to add nitrogen fertilizer every year, or the plants will be stunted and yellow. But beans fix nitrogen. They have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in their roots that pull nitrogen from the air and convert it into a form plants can use. And beans produce far more nitrogen than they need, which means the excess goes into the soil and feeds the corn. And that means you never need to buy nitrogen fertilizer. The beans do it for free. Corn grows tall and straight, and beans are climbing plants that need support. And in a Three Sisters Guild, the cornstalk becomes the trellis. The beans wind around the corn and climb toward the sun. And this vertical arrangement means you are growing two crops in the same space, which doubles your yield per square foot without increasing your labor. Squash grows low and spreads wide, and the large leaves shade the soil, which keeps it cool and moist. And that means less evaporation, which means less watering. And the dense shade also blocks light from reaching the soil surface, which means weed seeds cannot germinate, and that means no weeding. And squash leaves are covered in tiny prickly hairs that deter pests. Beetles and caterpillars avoid them, and that means the entire guild gets passive pest protection without sprays. And this is just 3 plants, but the principle scales. You can build guilds around tomatoes, around fruit trees, around perennial vegetables, around any crop you want to grow. The Three Sisters Guild is not folklore. It is a functional system that has been tested and refined over thousands of years. And it works because each plant contributes something the others need, which creates a closed loop that sustains itself without external inputs. And this is the principle you need to understand if you want to stop spending money and time on your garden, which is that plants can either compete or cooperate. And in a monoculture, they compete. They compete for nutrients, for water, for light. And that competition weakens them and makes them vulnerable to pests and disease. But in a polyculture, they cooperate, and cooperation creates abundance. And once you understand this principle, you can apply it to any crop. You can build a guild around tomatoes by planting basil to deter aphids and hornworms, and planting lettuce at the base to shade the soil and retain moisture. You can build a guild around fruit trees by planting comfrey to mine deep nutrients, and nitrogen-fixing clover to feed the tree while suppressing weeds. You can build a guild in a container by combining a deep-rooted plant with a shallow-rooted plant, so they occupy different soil layers and do not compete. And the result is that you stop needing fertilizers because nitrogen-fixing plants provide it. You stop needing pest control because aromatic plants and diverse plantings confuse and deter pests. You stop needing mulch because ground covers do it. You stop needing irrigation because dense plantings and living mulch retain moisture. And that means you stop spending money. And you stop spending time. And the garden starts working for you instead of against you. Now let's talk about soil, because this is where most gardeners waste the most money and create the most problems. In a conventional garden, you buy compost and fertilizer and amendments every single year, and you spread them on the surface or dig them in. And within a few months, they are gone. Used up by plants, washed away by rain, broken down by heat, and the soil is back to where it started, or worse. And that means you are on a treadmill of constant inputs just to maintain baseline fertility. But here is what most people miss. Soil does not need to be fed. Soil builds itself if you let it. And the way it builds itself is through plant residues. Every leaf that falls, every stem that dies, every root that decays adds organic matter to the soil. And that organic matter feeds soil organisms. And soil organisms break it down into humus. And humus holds water, holds nutrients, and creates the structure that makes soil alive instead of dead. And this process is called chop and drop, and it is the foundation of self-regulating soil fertility. Chop and drop means you cut plants at soil level when they are done producing, and you leave the stems and leaves right where they fall. You do not pull them out. You do not compost them in a bin. You do not haul them away. You leave them in place, and they break down right there and feed the soil exactly where your next crop will grow. And this method has two major advantages over traditional composting. The first is that it saves you time. No turning, no hauling, no waiting for a pile to cook. And the second is that it feeds soil organisms directly instead of going through an intermediary step. And that means faster nutrient cycling and healthier soil biology. And when you combine chop and drop with nitrogen-fixing plants, you create a system where fertility increases every year instead of decreasing. Because legumes pull nitrogen from the air and store it in their roots. And when you cut them and leave them in place, that nitrogen goes directly into the soil. And that nitrogen feeds your next crop without you buying anything. Water is the other major expense and time sink in conventional gardens. Because bare soil dries out fast, and shallow-rooted annuals planted in rows have no way to retain moisture. And that means you are watering every single day just to keep plants alive. But in a polyculture, water retention is built into the design. Dense plantings shade the soil. Living mulch covers the surface. Deep-rooted plants pull moisture from lower layers and make it available to shallow-rooted plants through root networks. And the result is that soil stays moist for days or even weeks without irrigation. And this changes your watering strategy completely. Because instead of watering daily with light sprinkles that encourage shallow roots, you water deeply once or twice a week. And deep watering encourages deep roots. And deep roots access moisture that shallow roots cannot reach. And that makes plants more drought tolerant and more resilient when conditions change. Now let's talk about how you actually set this up. Because understanding the principles is one thing, building a system that works in your space is another. And the best way to start is small. 1 guild bed, 4 to 6 plants. A system you can observe and learn from before you scale up. Here is a simple guild that works in most climates and most soil types. Beans, tomatoes, basil, and lettuce. 4 plants with 4 different functions. Beans fix nitrogen, and tomatoes are heavy feeders that need a lot of nitrogen. And that means the beans feed the tomatoes without you buying fertilizer. Tomatoes grow tall, and beans can climb if you give them support. And that means you can use the tomato cage or stake as a trellis for the beans. And that doubles your yield in the same space. Basil is an aromatic herb that deters aphids, whiteflies, and hornworms. And all 3 of those pests attack tomatoes. And that means the basil provides passive pest protection without sprays. Lettuce grows low and fast, and it shades the soil around the base of the tomatoes and beans. And that keeps soil cool and moist and blocks weed seeds from germinating. And this guild fits in a space 4 feet by 4 feet. And once it is established, it requires almost no maintenance. You water deeply twice a week, you harvest lettuce as it matures, you harvest beans and tomatoes as they ripen, and at the end of the season, you cut everything at soil level and leave the residue in place. And the next spring, you plant the same guild in the same spot. And the soil is better than it was the year before, because the bean roots added nitrogen and the plant residues added organic matter. And that is the core principle of self-regulating garden design. You plant once, you harvest for months, you cut and leave residue. And the system improves itself year after year. Planting density matters. Too far apart and you lose the benefits of shade and pest confusion. Too close, and plants compete for light and nutrients. And the sweet spot for most guilds is 12 to 18 inches between plants. Close enough to create a canopy that shades soil, far enough apart that air circulates and prevents fungal disease. And this density feels wrong to most gardeners, because conventional spacing is based on monoculture row production, where every plant needs maximum individual space. But in a polyculture, plants share resources and create microclimates. Seed saving is the final piece that makes this system truly zero cost. Because once you save seeds from your own plants, you never need to buy seeds again. And the process is simple. You let 2 or 3 plants of each variety bolt and go to seed. And you wait until the seed pods dry on the plant. And then you harvest them, shell them if needed, and store them in a cool, dark place. And the next spring, you plant them. And they grow just as well as store-bought seeds because they are adapted to your specific soil and climate. And this works for most vegetables: beans, peas, lettuce, tomatoes, peppers, squash, cucumbers. All of them produce viable seeds that you can save and replant year after year. Succession planting is another key technique for continuous harvest. Because if you plant all your lettuce at once, it all matures at once, and you have more lettuce than you can eat for 2 weeks, and then nothing for the rest of the season. But if you plant a small amount every 2 to 3 weeks, you get continuous harvest from spring through fall. And this works for radishes, lettuce, beans, carrots, and any other fast-maturing crop. And this strategy also reduces waste, because you are only harvesting what you need when you need it, instead of dealing with a glut followed by scarcity. This system scales to any size space. If you have a full yard, you can build multiple guilds in rows or beds. If you have raised beds, you can fit 1 or 2 guilds per bed depending on size. If you only have containers, you can build mini guilds with a determinate tomato, a compact bean variety, and lettuce around the base. And if you have HOA restrictions or aesthetic concerns, you can build ornamental guilds that look like flower beds. Purple basil, scarlet runner beans with red flowers, compact cherry tomatoes, and colorful lettuce varieties all look beautiful together. And they produce food while meeting appearance standards. The first year requires setup work. You are preparing beds, planting guilds, learning what works in your space. But the second year is easier, because the soil is better, the system is established, and you know what to expect. And by the third year, the garden is running itself, and you are spending a fraction of the time you used to spend, while harvesting more food than you did in your conventional garden. And that means you are no longer paying for the same vegetables year after year. And you are no longer doing the same work year after year. And you are no longer trapped in the dependency cycle that the industrial food system relies on. Think about how much time you spent last year on garden maintenance. If you are like most gardeners, you spend an hour a day watering during the growing season. And that is 7 hours a week, 28 hours a month. And you spent 2 hours every weekend weeding. And that is another 8 hours a month. And you spent time applying pest controls, adding fertilizers, replacing plants that died, troubleshooting problems. And add it all up, and you are looking at 40 hours a month or more. And that is a full-time job on top of your actual job. Now compare that to a self-regulating garden. You water deeply twice a week, which takes an hour total. You do occasional chop and drop maintenance, which takes an hour a month. You harvest, which takes 2 hours a week, and that is 12 hours a month. And that is it. No weeding because ground covers handle it. No pest control because plant relationships handle it. No fertilizing because nitrogen fixers handle it. No replacing dead plants because resilient polycultures survive where monocultures fail. And that is a savings of 28 hours a month, 336 hours a year, 14 full days that you get back to spend on things that matter more than fighting your garden. Now think about money. Most gardeners spend $200 to $500 per year on garden inputs: seeds, starts, fertilizers, amendments, pest sprays, irrigation supplies, tools, and that is just the direct cost. And if you factor in the value of your time at even a modest hourly rate, the real cost is much higher. A self-regulating garden costs you nothing after the first season, because you are saving seeds instead of buying them, because soil builds instead of depletes, because plants provide their own pest control and fertility and mulch. And that means $200 to $500 per year stays in your pocket. And over 10 years, that is $2,000 to $5,000. Over 20 years, $4,000 to $10,000. And that is money you do not have to earn, do not have to spend, and do not have to give to companies that profit from keeping you dependent. And the soil trajectory tells the same story. In a conventional garden, soil depletes over time because monocultures extract nutrients without replacing them. And that means you have to add more inputs every year just to maintain the same production. And eventually, the soil becomes so degraded that nothing grows well, no matter how much you add. But in a self-regulating garden, soil improves every year because nitrogen fixers add fertility, because chop and drop adds organic matter, because polycultures support diverse soil biology. And that means your garden gets easier and more productive every year instead of harder and less productive. Indigenous methods were not primitive. They were systems optimized through thousands of years of observation and refinement. And they worked because they were designed around cooperation instead of extraction, around relationships instead of intervention, around building soil instead of mining it. And the reason these methods disappeared from modern practice is the same reason you spend hundreds of dollars and hundreds of hours every year on your garden. Because the industrial food system profits from your dependence. And a garden that regulates itself eliminates that dependence. You are not bad at gardening. You were gardening backwards. You were fighting nature instead of working with it. You were extracting from soil instead of building it. You were buying solutions to problems that your design created. And now you know there is another way. A way that gives you more food with less time and less money. A way that builds soil instead of depletes it. A way that works with ecological relationships instead of against them. You can stop paying and fighting. Design a system that gives time back.